Without further ado, I would like to introduce our today's presentation. So Bruce is on the line. He is the chair of the Marine Ecosystem Research at Cape Breton University, and he is also the director of the Bredor Marine Institute. He tries to develop and use synoptic ecological tools to understand land ocean interactions in the coastal zone, but of course he is often frustrated, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that today. So his talk is entitled Ecologists' Thoughts on Why Marine Geomatics is So Much Harder Than It Looks. This is a topic a bit near and dear to my heart. So without further ado, Bruce, I'm going to let you share your screen. So I'll stop sharing.
And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Candace, for the invitation, and thank you all for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. I hope that you'll mostly be looking what I've got in the screen and not looking at a picture of me sitting in my office, although I must say I'm very happy to be sitting in my office. I haven't been in it for 7 months, so it's nice to be back here. So yeah, this is an honor to speak to you, and I think my title and my abstract says what I'm going to talk about, so I'll just get right on with it. I've been working at this for about 50 years, and here's something from my honors thesis at Dalhousie, where my job was to go and run transects either by snorkeling or diving, depending on the depth of the water, to measure the biomass and productivity of salt marsh plants in Peswick Inlet, which was an ecosystem that was being studied by the Marine Ecology lab at the MEL at the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. And certainly this was where I'd only learned to dive a few years before this. This was my first scientific diving. And it's where I learned how hard it is to know where you are in an ecosystem and to be able to get back to where you were. And then how to take the kinds of data that you collect and to make them available to fellow scientists and anybody else who was interested in a way that was effective. The picture being worth 1,000 words. And so now 50 years later, a group of us have established the first manned research station in one of Canada's newest marine protected areas, the St. Anne's Bank MPA. And there's only one location in that entire protected area that's shallow enough to do open circuit scuba diving. And that's on the top, the very tippy top of the Scattery Bank. I've been there 4 times now, and I have yet to find the equipment that I put there when I first went. And I still have this problem of finding my way back to places where I've put expensive equipment or made measurements and wish to repeat them. And that really captures, I think, the essence of why an ecologist is interested in geomatics. So I am not going to take you through this lecture slide. I just want you to appreciate that the science of ecology, which is a young science, probably a little older than the science of geomatics, but not a lot older. And if you include map making, well, ecology is far younger than the science of geomatics. So I always assume that word geomatics involves something digital, that it doesn't actually include ancient map making, but perhaps it does. I should have looked it up before I presume to give you guys a seminar on the topic. But I want you to recognize that as ecology has evolved from simply trying to estimate the numbers of animals within a population in which there's no explicit, but rather an implicit spatial domain, dimension, simply, well, the domain of this model is whatever area is occupied by that population. We really don't need to know that area. All we need to know is how many animals there are now. It also emphasizes the importance of the time domain to ecologists. Time is always the primary dimension in ecology, and spatial dimensions came in later. And it's really quite recently at the bottom of this list that you see 2 to full 3-dimensional spatially explicit theory and model, and considering time the 4th dimension, 4D. So I have a little. Here's Malthus, the first population ecologist, 1838, and there are no spatial dimensions here. This could be the population of a small village in Wales, or it could be the top population of the globe. And the essential point is that these different functions, one of which is linear and one of which is exponential, leads us to a situation where we can have people who don't have what they need, and that can start to reduce the population through mortality and morbidity. And we now know as ecologists that we can have these things going on in many parts of the world, even while the global population shows no sign of resource constraint. So much of ecology can be done without space, but by adding spatially explicit components, we really move from the abstract and what's often the useless abstract in terms of saying, okay, what should we do about the fact that this population is about to crash and go extinct, and we don't want that to happen. So some of the people who've really moved things along from 1838 to 2015 are conservation ecologists who superimpose real-time tracking of the movement of mammals, in this case, through habitats of different suitability that have been more or less altered by human activities. And so, to me, this shows the power of mixing ecology with geomatics. And I think it's fair to say that geomatics has the potential to revolutionize ecology and is indeed in the process of doing so. The biggest issue, and there are many issues in developing a ecological geomatics, is that of time-space scaling. Remembering that time is the master parameter for ecological processes. Everything is considered through time. Whereas much of geomatics is a snapshot. It's producing the good map. And of course, everything changes on the face of the earth and underneath the earth, but often that change is so slow relative to the things that interest us as humans, whether it's moving rum from Jamaica to Newfoundland or salt cod in the other direction, that we don't really have to worry about the fact that the map we made 10, 20, 30 years ago is still a good map. So I've listed, I'm not going to go through these, some of the issues that face us when we attempt to say, nope, if ecologists, ecology and geomatics are going to get together, we need our geomatics to be time dependent and to be able to portray the spatial evolution of ecological systems through time. And, you know, this example of Henry Stommel's famous diagram, they're just called these days a Stommel diagram, shows both the beauty of the bigger is slower generalization, but also show how there is considerable non-linearity outside of the central tendency, and that it differs with different kinds of ecological organization, from things that are going on at the molecular level or in closed incubations of plankton in glass bottles, up to the movements of wide-ranging animals or indeed entire ecosystems. So it's not a slam dunk to say, hey, I know the spatial scale, therefore I know the temporal scale that's relevant to what's going on here. So the challenge, I think, is to take the ways of thinking and the tools that geomatics science uses and to adapt them to basically this diagram. And it means that the way that you deal with spatial data is going to differ according to the timescales of the ecological process that you're interested in. The way to do this is to develop synoptic ecological tools, ones that give us that synoptic picture, but it is a picture that changes through time. And so the maps become movies. And these tools, I think, really are your bread and butter, all of you hopefully still listening to me here. Everything from good old surveying that humans do because the most valuable thing we have other than our lives and our basic needs is land. And so we have cared about being very good about saying whose land is whose and how much of it there is and that sort of thing. And much of what follows here in this list has come from that groundwork of really wanting to be able to be repeatably specific about finding out where we are and how to get back to where we are. So this list of things that you folks are all doing have, they're like a candy store for an ecologist because it doesn't even take a great deal of imagination to see how these tools can be applied to ecological questions, ecological problem solving. And so, and indeed they are being. So here is a map of the delta of sediments extending from the Columbia River into the Pacific Ocean. The dots are where samples were taken. And these are a measure of the thickness of the sediment which are occupied by microbial organisms doing their jobs. And the Ringgold elevation. So this is all very familiar to you. You see eastings and northings. You see obviously krigged and interpolated surfaces of elevation. You see waypoints depicted as places where sampling actually occurred. And not surprisingly, that's where the the centroids of the highs and lows seem to have been drawn around. And it brings up many issues for an ecologist looking at this, wondering how much of the pattern we see is reality and how much of the pattern we see is which particular algorithm the geomatic specialist chose to make a map out of these samples. And something I really value about this is the way that it is used to test variable hypotheses about how microbial populations disperse through space over time using different, homogenized, variable, limited, or undominated algorithms for the spread of microbes. So, and indeed, if you look at this paper, they've actually made some movies. I didn't think I'd have the bandwidth, and maybe I didn't have the ability to load movies up, so I don't have the movie to show you, but this is a great example of how these pictures are worth thousands of words. In fact, you couldn't portray this in words. And to turn this into a movie to show how changes in the outflow of the Columbia River and the sediment load it carries will affect benthic microbial abundance, and then from that can be determined rates of microbial metabolism and benthic pelagic coupling, the rate at which nutrients are reintroduced to the water column. These are very powerful tools that depict the structure and function of ecosystems through time. So geomatics are great for all these good reasons, especially the level of innovation you folks show in bringing together old established as well as new and innovative technologies, synthesizing them through big data tools and generating applications and graphic user interfaces so that people can ask what if questions. And I've seen many of you at work, and I love that stuff. Ecologists, I think, push the envelope for applications of geomatics for the reasons listed here. One, we're rarely just interested in a surface, whether it's changing or not. It's not just a point cloud of a variable elevation or whatever, even though it takes gigabytes of data to analyze LiDAR data and produce that surface and so on. We want to be adding a whole bunch of other variables, some of which are qualitative and age structured. That is, it's not just, is that organism present or not, but how old is that organism, because the way it uses space will differ as it ages. Most of the inputs and outputs to these applications are indeed time dependent. And so you can't just, it's very important to identify the initial conditions when you set up a spatial model. We use both Eulerian, which I'm sure you mostly work in Euler's world, but also Lagrangian frames of reference, where really our frame of reference is not the geoid or something fixed literally in the cosmos, if you want to stretch it that far, but it moves with the organism that's moving. So, you know, that's quite challenging, even when you come to just look at the way you set up the Navier-Stokes equations to model the movement of materials in the air or in the water or over the land surface. The way the code is written and the limitations on the relationship between the pixel size and the time step, you know, the old Courant criteria, differ greatly whether you're using Eulerian or Lagrangian frames of reference. And the domains in which ecologists work, you know, are often remote and expensive and dangerous. And certainly in most of my experiences with the oceans, and that's the case. And finally, and I'm a great example of this, you know, the ecologists are trying to do these things that many of you are struggling with and sort of leading the field with little or no training in geomatics. So certainly we have not fully realized the promise here. So synoptic ecological tools, I thought I'd have a little play on words here. You know, I think often ecologists are quite foolish when they walk into the geomatics world, the candy shop. And these are the kinds of questions that ecologists have. And these are the kinds of information that ecologists need to address those questions. And, you know, I've harped a little bit on the where is it? I really need to be able to find that thing again. I saw a scallop on the seabed when I was looking at the enhancement we've been doing in the Sydney Harbor. And I need to go back in the future and see whether that scallop has survived or not. And if it has survived, I need to see how much it's grown. And of course, scallops can swim, so I need to see how far it's moved or whether it stayed put. So I'm sure you can appreciate that in 15 meters of water, and most of the time except this year, you know, friggin' cold, it's just not easy to do that thing. And where you drop the diver in the water to start looking for that friggin' scallop is really, really important. You only have a little bit of bottom time there. And it's ridiculously difficult to do that. You know, to put people, or now my new ROV, back at that place that it needs to be. Why is that so difficult? And you know, so it goes. I don't have time to go through this list, but I tell you, I could talk for 10 minutes about each of these questions, because I and many others smarter than I have struggled with these. And so on the face of it, these seem like, well, simple questions, but you know, the simple questions are often the hardest. And I think we're rarely able to understand the degree of error we have when we apply geomatics tools to answer these questions, but we need to do that. So I think when, you know, geomatics may feel they've solved some challenges to, for example, putting yourself right back in the exact place, but in practice, for the ecologist, adapting that tool often doesn't work very well. So a lot of this is about technologies, and here's a list of enabling technologies for ecology. And I would simply say that the usefulness of these is highly variable, but if I can make a generalization, always harder than you think it will be, or at least than I think it will be. And that translates to my students. Sometimes I'll just hand them the thing. If I can find it, I'll hand them the instruction manual, although they rarely come with them anymore. They're supposed to be on their websites or on their apps. But out in the boat, out of cell phone range, it's not much use unless you've got the hard copy right in your hand to figure out why this piece of gear that only has 2 buttons isn't doing what it's supposed to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those problems, but I think the more important thing is for you to think about these technologies, many of which I know that you use, and try to think, what did the learning curve look like? How many mistakes did you make before you got it smooth and comfortable? How much did it cost you finding out you bought the wrong thing because you didn't really know enough, because the advertising only tells you it can do everything? And then try to imagine someone who doesn't have your training trying to become familiar and use these technologies. So these are both a boon. I mean, my life changed profoundly when I got my first GPS. It was like magic. Before we were setting up stations and having to do radio triangulations or using horizontal sextant angles, and it was just unbelievable. Now, I find myself cursing at the GPS as much as I cursed at trying to hold that sextant level. So for me anyway, there have been a number of disabling technologies. And I'm going to take a little bit of time and try to spice this up a bit. So I have, for me, a $3,000 Chartplotter. It's like the fisherman's version of Furuno's gear. That's a fairly big expense. And you can see it does an incredible job of seeing both my CTD at the bottom and then seeing each of my Niskin bottles on the line. But what I really want it to do, and it does a great job, of showing where I am, and it's got a side scan sonar transducer that I can switch in, and it's got a bottom penetrating profiler. It's very cool and very capable, but it has this stupid NEMA output. And can I get it to give me both time, latitude and longitude with the time step, as well as depth? Nope, I can't. So I really want this thing to be giving me what I know it has, which is X, Y, and minus Z, or depth. And I want it to give it to me in a way that I can easily deal with in an ASCII file that I can then move in and combine with data from other sources. And I will figure it out, but they don't make it easy. Here's my latest CTD. Now, you may not think of this as a geomatics tool, but I need to know X, Y, and particularly the Z of where I deploy this thing. And I use it both in a horizontal mode, towing it through surface plumes and gradients, as well as in the more common vertical mode of lowering it through the water column. It does a very good job of the Z. It even has a GPS, but of course, as soon as it goes below the surface, that's of no use. And so this very modern machine that can only be dealt with by talking to it through an app on your cell phone has been a large source of frustration as I try to get spatially explicit data on water column structure. We really realized that we needed to have a better knowledge of where we were, whether we were on the shoreline of a Barachois pond looking at changes in the shape since the ice dam, or whether we were on the boat and trying to go back to a particular place. We needed something better than any of the GPS units, including the one in that expensive sounder that were on my vessel. And so we invested in something that I'm sure is very familiar to you folks, survey equipment. Well, I predict it'll be about a year before I have figured out how to make this work. I counted no less than 16 questions I had to answer on a sketchy, phone connection to try to get into the Cantel, base correction network, as an example. And as for the amount of jargon you need to know to do any post-processing of these files, well, those of you who do it know what's involved. And these are the cheap ones. The ones that the real professional gear sort of start in the $70,000 range. And money is an issue for scientists. Acoustic anything, acoustic tags, acoustic receivers, acoustic modems, things that try to make the water behave like the air are very difficult. So here we have our fish listening devices that we try to put in very exact locations, but I can assure you that there's about plus or minus 400 meters between where that device is and where the fish that has the tag in it that it records actually is relative to it. You can see that this river here is nowhere near 400 meters wide. Plus, they very quickly foul up and stop working. So as well as having to collect them and deploy them, you have to go and clean them regularly. Latest toy, $100,000 ROV, 300 meters of cable. And so far, the only way we know where it is, other than when it's right beside the boat and we have a fix in the boat and we can see it, is to measure how many meters of line are out and what depth it's at, and to bring it to the surface in the end and run the boat as fast as we can to it before it drifts away and take a fix there and assume it moved in a straight line. Well, how stupid is that? So we now have a $25,000 ultra short base line tracker that basically talks to this thing as it's underwater. I can tell you, there was no need to buy a fancy GPS for the boat because the error in the triangulation on where this thing is underwater is in the tens of meters range. So I could make do with the cell phone and the GPS in my cell phone to know where the boat is, because that's not the weak link in the chain of figuring out a track over the seabed that this machine has followed. And it goes on. I'm not going to talk to you about my experience with the Cassie because I probably used some bad words, and so it goes. Here's just a culmination. You see all those beautiful lines? Well, I used some nice software and laid those out. This is where the barge that deployed the rock enhancement in the Sydney Harbor was supposed to follow. And this guy had the very best, like the professional vectored GIS on the barge, but these are the tracks he was able to follow as he dumped the rock on the seabed with the barge. And now I have to try to sample those with that ROV. I'll tell you, I'm probably just going to put a diver in the bottom and we'll find one of them and follow it. So not user friendly. So why, almost done here, why is this so difficult? There's no one answer to that. And you're probably thinking, well, because you're stupid, Bruce. But other than that, when you add extra dimensions and extra variables that do not scale linearly as the domain of the area you wish to have a spatial depiction or a map or a movie of, the complexity and the difficulty really go up. And these do become essentially intractable problems given our current capabilities, technologies, and wallets. And because thinking back to the Stommel diagram, larger generally takes longer, but not always, then you can have these scale mismatches where you're collecting data at one scale and attempting to derive model outputs at a finer scale, and you just, the errors are unacceptable. And add to that things don't always happen fast in ecological time, and so observation periods can be years and decades. And so, really costs and human resources come into that in a big way. I think a huge part of my problem, and this isn't true of all ecologists, many ecologists don't work in the ocean, is that water is so much soupier than air. All of those things, lively, it's full of life. So not only is it lumpy, full of particles, but a lot of the particles move around and change their density over time and change their size over time. So it's an added burden to be trying to do geomatics underwater. I think this middle bullet is the one I come up against the most. When you look at surveying and nautical surveying, if you wish, or nautical geomatics, where they still can't decide whether we're going to do it in decimal degrees or decimal minutes or degrees, minutes, seconds. We have some really over mature technologies and techniques where people just aren't willing to let go of the tried and true methods, not of the last decade, but of the last century. And then on the other hand, we have technologies and techniques that people are so anxious to push them out to get their next, innovation grant that are really should never be out in the market. Way too immature. You're not getting, they should be paying us to do the beta testing on some of the gear they're selling us rather than selling it to us as if it can do what they say it can do. I think you've seen that often the tasks that ecology has are not matched by the tools and technologies that are common usage in geomatics. The tools and skills, as most of you know, are fairly rare and they're expensive, both in terms of money and human resources. I think if you're a big engineering company, you can absolutely afford to have those professional on-staff geomatics specialists, but if you're a research ecologist in a university, you're unlikely to have that. And then there are some really quite sort of, you know, there is a difference between scientists and engineers. And much of the work of geomatics is within the context of engineering. And this isn't like a judgment of one better than the other. This is an observation that, you know, it's like having someone that speaks French and someone that speaks English trying to get together and, you know, do something complicated. It's not so easy. And you know, this whole thing with professional engineers, professional surveyors, for example, it doesn't really matter that I pay my money to CanNet. It's apparent in my first call to them that I'm not a surveyor, and they're sort of wondering what the hell I'm doing on their net. So, you know, there are those kinds of issues, and so I think, you know, ecological geomatics, if there is such a thing, is in its infancy and it needs help. So this is my last slide. What can we do? Well, here are just some ideas. You know, I haven't found the Geomatics for Dummies book, but when there is one, I'm going to get it. It would be nice to have some universal standards for spatial measurement and data, and you're all going to jump up and say, oh, of course we have those, but I guess it's a question of what does universal mean? The universe doesn't extend very far into my world. I believe that just as all our undergraduate science students are required to take a statistics course, I think they should absolutely be required to take a geomatics course. I think John Boxall is you know, right on you know, with that initiative at Dalhousie, and I think it's a big part of changing those last couple of points that I raised in the previous slide. I'd like to see some deprofessionalization. We're D things, right? Now, I didn't say defunding, although I'd like to see the gear get cheaper too, of that whole surveying and nautical and just that whole thing. It's still pretty exclusive and a club. It is a profession and it needs to be professionalized, but I think that it can also be made more accessible. And beginning with instruction manuals. Yeah, I've already talked about what I'd like sounders to be able to do. And technologies that are really integrated. I find I buy a piece of gear and then I have to buy another piece of gear to make it do what I want. And then I have to buy a piece of software to make that do what I want. It would be nice to have, and then I have to make them all talk to each other. We could have, particularly in a place with GANS and Nova Scotia with its network of universities and a relatively, you know, small population, we could have some sharing networks for gear, data, and skills. And yeah, we could, as you've done by inviting me here, put aside or circumvent disciplinary and professional barriers to integration. So geomatics has and will benefit from partnerships with ecologists, just as ecologists absolutely have and will continue to benefit from partnerships with those of you in geomatics. Thank you for listening to me for so long and for your attention. I'd be happy to discuss this further at the bar after the meeting. That's what I'd really like to do. I'll let maybe, is that going to happen? Over.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I wish the bar was happening. Unfortunately, this year, we're going to have to take a rain check.
Just kidding.
Oh, I'm not.
I know.
If everyone could take themselves off of mute for a minute and give Bruce a hand for that great presentation, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks very much.
So I need to give you back your desktop, do I?
Sure, yeah. So you just say stop sharing.
So let me just see.
And while you're doing that, does anyone have any questions for Bruce? I didn't see any come up in the chat, but feel free to ask if anyone has any.
I'm not sure how to stop sharing this. Let me see. Stop.
That's okay. I can probably just kick
Can you
off.
unshare me? Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
No problem. Okay, yeah.
I have a question,
So,
Dr. Hatcher.
yes.
Thank you for your presentation, very informative. One thing you mentioned early on was the idea of predictive modeling. And in our industry, this makes its way into our business from time to time. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are and how we've progressed with predictive modeling over, say, your career. Is it becoming significantly more beneficial now, i.e. we're more likely able to depend on the results of that? And I guess when I ask that, I'm thinking about things like climate change or really any business specific item where you might create a predictive model. It just seems to me that if we can get greater confidence in models, then yeah, they're just going to be that much more beneficial. And I realize predictive modeling is complex, many variables, so I'll put that to you.
Thank you for that. I think everybody will have different answers to that, but I'll bet you that we will converge on predictive modeling is immensely better than it was 20 years ago. And the major reason for that are not new equations. They are whoever made that law about computing power, but it's computing power, which allows our models to have shorter time steps and finer grids, you know, smaller pixel sizes, and yet to still run as fast as we need them to, which needs to be obviously faster than real time. The other critical input, and I'm talking about things that I know about but don't do myself, so that's important, is nudging with real data. And that's huge. So all models that are predictive models that simulate alternative futures will diverge. It doesn't really matter what the structure of the model is. Over time, it will get less and less precise in its predictions. But if you can reach in with observational data periodically, literally as the model's running, and give it a little nudge and say, no, the value of that variable that you predicted is this. Let's say it's oxygen concentration, which is something that, you know, I am doing some work on and quite concerned about. As our waters warm, their ability to hold oxygen decreases, but there are a number of other factors that affect oxygen concentration. And it's a big deal for fisheries and aquaculture. If you can reach in periodically and say, no, I'm measuring oxygen in this place where you say it's this, it's actually that. So I think those two things have, our increase in computing power and our ability both to make good measurements in real time and get the data, even if it's on the seabed or something, get the data in real time to put into models, to sort of nudge them back on track, mean that they are getting better, and we must depend upon them, and we must see those numerical simulation models as having to be, by definition, spatially explicit, and we should see them as synoptic ecological tools that are used to support decision making. Not to make decisions, of course, but to support decision making. We hear people talking about adaptation to climate change, people who have ability to influence it, like politicians or the heads of various provincial and federal and municipal departments, and they have to make decisions with big implications for money, for human resources, and also for public attitude, and they will welcome better models. So, do I have absolute faith in predictive models? No. Do I see predictive models as our best and most affordable way to test various hypotheses about what is important, determining what's going to happen to oxygen in the Bredor Lakes, or what's going to happen to the shoreline in south of Halifax or something? Yes, I do have great faith in that aspect.
Great, thank you for that, and thanks for your question, Harold. We have a couple of comments in the chat. The first one is from Daniel Bryce. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I think many of your issues are not isolated to your discipline. I would have to agree with that. I think biologists and a lot of different industries have a lot of problems that you are encountering with, especially equipment not communicating with each other, and the NEMA string problem. That's been a problem for a while. So you're not alone on that. Ted McKinnon said collaboration or sharing of geomatics resources would be a good initiative for GANS to try, and Dave agreed. So that would be very interesting. If somebody else has already tried something and it didn't work, then maybe we could save somebody some effort down the line. Don't try that, it doesn't work. So, and I was thinking as well with your NEMA string problem, Bruce, maybe that would be something that you might want to get a student to help with. You've got your own students, of course, but at COGS, they do have student projects at the end of the year. So it might be something a programmer might be interested in, something like that. Just a thought.
Well, thank you for those comments. I'm really glad that I'm not alone, and I know I'm not alone. And certainly there's nothing unique about ecology relative to geology or biology or all the ologies. There's almost no science in which there are not spatially explicit aspects that must be dealt with, and the more quantitative and the more accurate the dealing with them is, the better will be the outcomes of whatever science you're doing. And I also agree that part of the solutions to these challenges that we are all dealing with is, one of open sharing, one of, and that's always easier in sort of not-for-profit academic situations than elsewhere. But that doesn't mean it's easy, because academics also have hoarding mentalities and a preference for priority. They want to be the first to say something and or publish something, and so it's not just one big happy family. And then lastly, sure, I would dearly love to host a COGS student during that phase of their their program here. So certainly if there is a process for making a project proposal and putting it in, I guess this is sort of like a co-op thing. Well, yeah, you know, sort of not right here and now, but let me know what that is, and I'll certainly avail myself of that, because you know, there are students and there are students, and so it's one thing for a biology or ecology, or even I have an engineering student working with me to try to figure these things out, but it's going to be much easier for and more helpful and peer-to-peer learning for a student from a geomatics program to come and work on that. So yeah, great thoughts. Thank you all for sharing those comments and for listening to me. And yeah, I consider myself, you know, I think there was once a GANS meeting up here in Sydney, and I went to that and enjoyed that. And also when we have our access meetings, there are always a lot of overlap between people who are members of GANS and the Atlantic Canada Coastal and Estuarine Science Society. So yeah, thanks again. And also for giving me so much time with you today.
No problem. Well, thank you, Bruce. Much appreciated.